The cabin door slammed shut behind Ruth Moore as she stumbled into the bitter mountain cold, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air that seemed to crystallize and fall like tiny diamonds in the pale moonlight. Blood stained the torn fabric of her dress, dark crimson against the faded blue cotton that had once been her Sunday best, and her bare feet left crimson prints in the snow as she ran blindly through the towering pines. Each step sent shards of agony up her legs, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror that drove her forward through the skeletal branches that clawed at her skin like grasping fingers. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but the terror remained lodged in her chest like a jagged stone, sharp and unforgiving. With every ragged breath she drew, she had escaped, but to what? The wilderness stretched endlessly before her, indifferent to her suffering, promising only death by exposure or the wolves that howled in the distance like harbingers of doom. The moon hung cold and distant overhead, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow, making the familiar world seem alien and threatening. Her legs gave out near a frozen creek, and she collapsed against a massive boulder, shivering violently as the reality of her situation crashed over her like an avalanche. The stone was smooth and cold against her back, worn by centuries of wind and weather, and she pressed herself against it as if it might somehow absorb her pain and fear. 3 days had passed since the attack that shattered her world. 3 days since she had learned that some men were capable of unspeakable cruelty. 3 days of running and hiding and trying to forget the sound of their laughter as they destroyed everything she thought she knew about safety and trust. The bruises on her arms had darkened to deep purple, mottled with yellow and green at the edges where the healing had begun, and every muscle in her body ached from the violence she had endured. But it was the damage to her spirit that cut deepest, the way her skin crawled at the memory of unwanted hands, the way her heart raced at every sound, every shadow, every reminder that she was alone and vulnerable in a world that had shown her its cruelest face. Through the skeletal branches above, smoke rose from a distant chimney, a thin gray line against the pewter sky that spoke of warmth and shelter and the possibility of human kindness. Ruth forced herself to focus on that fragile thread of hope, using it to anchor herself when the panic threatened to sweep her away entirely. Someone lived up there, someone who might help or might prove to be another nightmare. She had no choice but to find out. Her fingers were already turning white from the cold, the skin tight and waxy, and she could feel the deadly lethargy of hypothermia beginning to creep through her limbs like a slow poison. The climb up the rocky slope took every ounce of strength she possessed, her muscles screaming in protest with each step. The path was treacherous, covered with patches of ice that sent her sliding backward, and loose stones that shifted under her weight. Twice she fell, scraping her knees raw against the jagged rocks. The pain sharp and immediate, but somehow cleaner than the ache in her soul. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her dress, but she pressed on, driven by the primal need to survive, to prove to herself and the world that she was more than what had been done to her. When she finally reached the small log cabin nestled among the pines like something out of a fairy tale, she barely had the strength to knock. Her fist made a weak, pathetic sound against the heavy wooden door, and she wondered if anyone would even hear it over the wind that moaned through the eaves like a living thing. The door opened almost immediately, as if the occupant had been watching her approach, and Ruth found herself face to face with a stranger who might be her salvation or her doom. James Baker stood in the doorway, a tall man with weathered hands that spoke of years of hard labor and eyes the color of storm clouds, deep gray with flecks of silver that caught the lamplight from within the cabin. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver at the temples, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face, giving him the appearance of a mountain prophet or a hermit from an old tale. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt that had seen better days and wool pants patched at the knees, but there was something about his stillness that spoke of barely contained power, like a wolf at rest but ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. For a moment, neither of them moved, and Ruth felt a familiar spike of fear as she waited for him to speak or act, her body tensing for flight even though she had nowhere left to run. She had learned to read men's faces, to look for the signs of violence or cruelty that might be hidden behind a friendly smile, and she searched his features now for any hint of the predatory gleam she had come to recognize and dread. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Instead of words, James simply stepped aside, opening the door wider in silent invitation. The gesture was so unexpected, so devoid of demand or expectation, that Ruth hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. But her body was failing, and the alternative was certain death in the cold. She stumbled across the threshold and immediately felt the blessed warmth of the fire radiating from a stone hearth, the heat hitting her like a physical embrace after hours in the bitter mountain air. The cabin was spartanly furnished but clean, with hand-hewn furniture that spoke of craftsmanship and care, and shelves lined with books that suggested an educated mind behind the rough exterior. It smelled of pine smoke and leather, masculine scents that should have been comforting, but instead made her stomach clench with remembered terror. Every surface was neat and organized, from the carefully stacked firewood beside the hearth to the simple wooden table set with a single place setting, as if the occupant had been expecting only himself for dinner. James closed the door quietly and moved to the fire, adding another log without fanfare, the flames leaping higher and casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He glanced at Ruth's torn dress and bloodied feet, but said nothing, his expression carefully neutral. Instead, retrieving a thick blanket from a chest near the wall. The blanket was soft wool, obviously well cared for, and it smelled faintly of cedar and mountain air. He approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal, and held out the blanket at arm's length, careful not to come too close or make any sudden movements that might startle her. "You're hurt," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. There was no question in the statement, no demand for explanation, just a simple acknowledgement of what his eyes could see. His accent carried traces of the East, educated vowels softened by years of mountain living, and Ruth found herself wondering what had brought a man like this to such an isolated place. "I can't," she whispered, the words barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "I can't bear another man's touch." The admission felt like tearing open a wound, exposing her vulnerability to a stranger who could use it against her if he chose. James nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that held no judgment, no impatience, no demand for further explanation. "Then I'll wait till you're ready," he said, the words carrying a weight of promise that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. Those 6 words hung in the air between them like a sacred vow, and Ruth felt something inside her chest loosen just slightly, a knot of tension that had been pulled tight since the night her world shattered. She had expected demands, questions, assumptions about what she owed him for his shelter. The kind of transactional thinking that reduced human kindness to a commodity to be bought and sold. Instead, he turned back to the fire and began preparing what looked like a simple meal, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude. His movements economical and purposeful. The cabin felt like a sanctuary carved from the wilderness itself, a pocket of civilization in the vast expanse of untamed mountain country. Thick log walls kept out the howling wind, and the fire cast dancing shadows that seemed almost alive, creating patterns on the walls that shifted and changed like living things. Ruth sank into a chair near the hearth, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders as she watched James work, noting how he moved with deliberate care, never making sudden gestures that might startle her, never turning his back completely, as if he understood that she needed to see his hands at all times. The chair was handmade, she realized, crafted with skill and attention to detail that spoke of someone who took pride in his work. The seat was worn smooth by years of use, and the arms bore the faint impressions of countless evenings spent reading or staring into the fire. Everything in the cabin spoke of a man who had chosen solitude but hadn't let it make him careless or crude. This was a home, not just a shelter. "There's a room upstairs," he said eventually, ladling soup into a wooden bowl that had been carved from a single piece of maple. The soup smelled rich and hearty, full of vegetables and herbs that made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. "Door has a lock. Keys on the inside." He set the bowl on a small table within her reach but didn't come closer, respecting the invisible boundary she had drawn around herself. "You'll be safe here." The promise was simple and direct, without flowery language or elaborate assurances, but something in his tone made her believe it. Ruth stared at the soup, her stomach cramping with hunger she had been too traumatized to notice. When was the last time she had eaten? The memory felt distant, buried under layers of pain and terror, and the exhausting effort of simply staying alive. She reached for the spoon with trembling fingers, and James retreated to the far side of the room, settling into a chair with his own bowl, giving her space to eat without feeling watched or judged. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind moaning through the eaves like a restless spirit. The soup was delicious, rich with the flavor of wild game and root vegetables, seasoned with herbs that must have been gathered from the mountain slopes. Ruth found herself stealing glances at her unexpected rescuer, trying to read his intentions in the set of his shoulders, the way he held his hands, the careful distance he maintained between them. Everything about him spoke of restraint, of power held carefully in check. He was easily twice her size, with the kind of strength that came from years of hard labor, broad shoulders and calloused hands that could probably snap her neck without effort. But he wielded that strength like a man who understood its potential for harm, keeping it leashed and controlled, using it to build and protect rather than dominate and destroy. When she finished eating, James stood and moved to a cabinet near the window, his footsteps careful and measured on the wooden floor. He returned with a small leather pouch and set it on the table between them, the leather worn smooth by years of handling. "Medicine," he explained, his voice gentle, "for the pain, and something to help you sleep without dreams." Ruth's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. How did he know about the dreams? How did he understand that sleep had become another form of torment, filled with grasping hands and cruel laughter and the sound of her own voice screaming for help that never came? She nodded gratefully and took the pouch, noting again how careful he was not to let their fingers touch, how he respected her need for space even in the simple act of passing an object between them. "The room upstairs," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long can I stay?" James was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if the flames might hold the answer to her question. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with possibility, with the recognition that they were both damaged people who had found themselves in an impossible situation. "Long as you need," he said finally, the words carrying absolute conviction. "Winter's coming hard this year. Spring's a long way off." The offer was generous beyond anything she had expected, and Ruth felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been prepared for conditional kindness, for help that came with strings attached, and expectations that would eventually need to be met. Instead, this stranger was offering her sanctuary without asking for anything in return, shelter from the storm both literal and metaphorical that had driven her to his door. That night, Ruth climbed the narrow stairs to the small room under the eaves, her legs shaking with exhaustion and the after effects of the medicine James had given her. The stairs creaked softly under her weight, and she could hear him moving around below, banking the fire and preparing the cabin for the night. True to James's word, there was a sturdy lock on the inside of the door, brass and iron, that looked like it could withstand a determined assault, and she turned the key with shaking fingers before collapsing onto the narrow bed. The room was simple but comfortable, with a small window that looked out over the moonlit clearing and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. The bed was covered with quilts that smelled of lavender and cedar, and there was a chair by the window where someone might sit and read or watch the changing seasons. It felt like a refuge, a place where she could begin the long process of healing, if such a thing were even possible. The medicine had dulled the worst of her physical pain, but her mind remained a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man who had taken her in without question? What did he want from her? Men always wanted something, in her experience. They might hide their desires behind kindness or concern, but eventually the mask would slip, and she would see the predator beneath. But as the hours passed and no footsteps sounded on the stairs, no rattling came at her door, Ruth began to believe that perhaps James Baker was different. Perhaps his promise to wait had been genuine, born of understanding rather than calculation. The thought was almost more terrifying than the alternative, because it meant she might have to confront the possibility of trust again. and trust felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The days that followed settled into a careful routine that felt both foreign and comforting after months of chaos and fear. James would leave early each morning to tend to his traps and check his snares, moving through the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost, and returning before dark with fresh game or fish from the creek that ran silver and cold through the valley below. He always announced himself before entering the cabin, calling out in his deep, steady voice, so Ruth would know it was him and not some stranger come to threaten the fragile peace they had built together. She spent her days by the fire, reading from his collection of books, or simply staring into the flames, trying to piece together the fragments of herself that remained after the violence that had shattered her world. The books were a revelation, a mixture of poetry and philosophy, adventure stories and treatises on everything from botany to astronomy. They spoke of a mind that hungered for knowledge and beauty, that found solace in words and ideas when human company proved too difficult or dangerous. Slowly, her body began to heal. The bruises faded from purple to green to yellow, following the predictable progression of trauma made visible, and the cuts on her feet scabbed over and began to close. She could walk without pain now, though she still moved carefully, as if expecting the ground to shift beneath her feet at any moment. But the deeper wounds remained raw, manifesting in the way she flinched at unexpected sounds, the way her heart raced whenever James moved too quickly or came too close, the way she found herself checking and rechecking the lock on her door each night. He seemed to understand this instinctively, maintaining a careful distance, even as he provided for her needs with a generosity that left her speechless. Hot meals appeared at regular intervals, always placed where she could reach them without him coming near. The food simple but nourishing, prepared with care and attention to detail. Clean clothes materialized, simple garments that fit well enough and smelled of mountain air and sunshine, obviously chosen with thought for her comfort and dignity. When she mentioned being cold one evening, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire, an extra blanket appeared on her chair the next morning, soft wool that had clearly been saved for special occasions. It was dyed a deep blue, the color of twilight sky, and when she wrapped it around her shoulders, she felt embraced by its warmth and the thoughtfulness behind the gift. "You don't have to do all this," Ruth said one afternoon, as James prepared to head out into the snow, pulling on the heavy coat that made him look even larger and more imposing than usual. "I'm not your responsibility." He paused in the doorway, his hand on the latch, and turned to look at her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Everyone's someone's responsibility," he replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Way I see it, you're mine now." The words should have frightened her, should have sounded possessive and threatening, like a claim of ownership that reduced her to property to be managed and controlled. Instead, they carried a weight of protection that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion, a promise of shelter that asked for nothing in return except the chance to help her heal. When had anyone last claimed responsibility for her welfare? When had anyone cared whether she lived or died? As the weeks passed, Ruthie began to venture beyond the confines of the cabin, her courage returning in small increments, like water filling a cracked vessel. At first, she only stepped onto the covered porch, breathing the sharp mountain air and watching the snow fall in lazy spirals, each flake unique and perfect in its brief moment of visibility before joining the endless white carpet that covered the world. Then she began taking short walks around the clearing, always staying within sight of the cabin, always ready to run back to safety at the first sign of danger. The clearing was larger than it had seemed from inside, perhaps an acre of open ground surrounded by towering pines that stood like silent sentinels against the sky. There was a woodshed, a small barn that housed a milk cow and a few chickens, and a smokehouse where James preserved the meat from his hunting. Everything was neat and well maintained, evidence of a man who took pride in his work and understood the importance of preparation in such an isolated place. James never questioned these expeditions, never tried to curtail her movements or demand explanations for where she had been or what she had seen. He simply watched from a distance, ready to help if needed, but never intruding on her fragile attempts at independence. It was a delicate balance, this dance of proximity and distance, and Ruth marveled at his intuitive understanding of what she needed, his ability to provide support without making her feel trapped or controlled. One evening, as they sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames casting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the log walls, Ruth found herself studying James's profile in the flickering light. His face was weathered by years of mountain living, lined with the kind of creases that came from squinting into bright snow and bitter wind, from seasons of solitude and the weight of whatever sorrows had driven him to this remote place. There was a scar along his jawline, barely visible beneath his beard, and his hands bore the calluses and small wounds of a man who worked with them every day. They were strong hands, capable of violence if necessary, but she had seen them handle delicate tasks with surprising gentleness. Mending a broken bird's wing, or carefully tending the fire to coax the maximum warmth from each precious log. "Why do you live up here alone?" she asked, the question emerging before she could stop it, her curiosity finally overcoming her caution. James was quiet for so long that Ruth thought he wouldn't answer, his gaze fixed on the flames as if they might reveal secrets she wasn't meant to know. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain, carefully controlled but never fully healed. "Sometimes a man does things he can't live with," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "Sometimes the only way to make peace with yourself is to get as far from other people as possible." Ruth understood that feeling intimately, the desire to disappear, to find a place where the past couldn't follow, and the future stretched out clean and unmarked like fresh snow. "What did you do?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Killed a man," James replied without hesitation, the admission hanging in the air between them like smoke. "He deserved it, but that doesn't make the weight any lighter to carry." The confession should have frightened her, should have sent her running for the stairs in the safety of her locked room. This man had admitted to taking a life, to being capable of ultimate violence, to having blood on his hands that no amount of mountain snow could wash clean. Instead, she felt a strange sense of kinship, a recognition that they were both carrying wounds that wouldn't heal, both seeking refuge in this remote place where the world couldn't reach them. The turning point came during a blizzard that raged for 3 days straight, a storm of such ferocity that it seemed like the mountain itself was trying to shake them loose from their precarious perch on its slopes. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and piling snow against the door until it reached the bottom of the frame, threatening to bury the cabin entirely. Ruth had grown accustomed to the mountain's moods, the way weather could change from benign to deadly in the space of minutes. But this storm felt different, more malevolent somehow, as if the wilderness itself was testing their resolve. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows, creating intricate patterns that might have been beautiful under other circumstances. The cabin groaned and creaked under the assault of wind and snow, and Ruth found herself wondering if the sturdy log walls would be enough to protect them from nature's fury. She had never experienced weather like this, had never understood how small and fragile human beings were in the face of such elemental power. On the second day, the fire began to die. James had been conserving wood, rationing their supply against the possibility of a long winter. But the cold was seeping through the walls like a living thing, finding every crack and crevice, turning their breath to visible clouds even inside the cabin. Ruth watched him feed the last of the split logs into the flames and saw the worry he tried to hide behind his stoic expression, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man calculating odds and finding them wanting. "There's more wood in the shed," he said, pulling on his heavy coat, the thick wool garment that would provide some protection against the killing cold, but might not be enough if he became lost or disoriented in the whirling snow. "I'll have to make a run for it." Ruth looked out the window at the wall of white that had swallowed the world beyond the glass, erasing all familiar landmarks and turning the short distance to the woodshed into a potentially fatal journey. "You can't go out in this. You'll get lost before you make it 10 feet. We'll freeze if I don't try." The simple truth of it settled between them like a stone, heavy and unavoidable. They both knew that without fuel for the fire, the cabin would become a tomb, their bodies found frozen when the spring thaw finally came. Ruth felt the familiar clutch of panic in her chest, the terror that had become her constant companion since the night her world shattered. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt almost like courage, fragile and new but real nonetheless. This man had risked everything to keep her safe, had asked for nothing in return except the chance to help her heal. Now it was her turn to take a risk, to prove that she was more than just a victim waiting to be rescued. "I'll go with you," she said, the words surprising them both, her voice steady despite the fear that made her hands shake. James turned to stare at her, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "Ruth, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She stood up, her legs shaking, but her voice growing stronger with each word. "We're stronger together than apart. That's what you've been trying to show me, isn't it?" For the first time since she had known him, James Baker smiled. It transformed his entire face, softening the harsh lines carved by weather and sorrow, revealing the man he might have been before whatever tragedy had driven him to the mountains. The smile reached his eyes, warming them like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and Ruth felt her heart skip in response to that unexpected glimpse of joy. "Together then," he said, the words carrying the weight of partnership, of shared risk and mutual trust. They bundled up in every piece of warm clothing they could find, layering wool and fur until they could barely move, their bodies transformed into shapeless bundles, designed more for survival than mobility. James wrapped a scarf around Ruth's face, leaving only her eyes exposed, and she did the same for him, their fingers clumsy with thick gloves but gentle with each other. When they stepped out into the howling chaos of the storm, the wind hit them like a physical blow, driving snow into their faces with the force of thrown sand. Ruth immediately understood why James had been reluctant to attempt the journey alone. Visibility was measured in inches rather than feet, and the cold was so intense it felt like breathing knives, each inhalation searing her lungs and making her chest ache. James took her hand, his fingers warm and strong through their gloves, and Ruth felt a moment of panic at the contact, her body's instinctive recoil from any man's touch. But then she realized that this touch was different, born of necessity and offered without expectation, a lifeline in the chaos that surrounded them. She squeezed back, letting him know she was ready, and together they began the treacherous journey across the clearing. They fought their way through drifts that came up to their waists, using the rope James had strung between the cabin and the woodshed as a guide, their lifeline in the white chaos that had erased all sense of direction. The distance that normally took 30 seconds stretched into an eternity of struggle against the wind and driving snow, each step a victory hard-won against the elements. Ruth's legs burned with the effort of lifting her feet high enough to clear the drifts, and her lungs ached from breathing the frigid air. But she pressed on, driven by determination and the knowledge that James was depending on her. This was her chance to prove that she was more than her trauma, more than the broken woman who had stumbled to his door seeking shelter. When they finally reached the shed, James had to put his shoulder against the door to force it open against the accumulated snow, the wood groaning in protest as it gave way. Inside, the wood was stacked neatly to the rafters, dry and ready to burn, each log carefully placed to maximize storage and ensure proper air circulation. They loaded their arms with as much as they could carry, the wood heavy and awkward in their gloved hands, and began the treacherous journey back. Halfway across the clearing, Ruth stumbled. The snow had shifted during their passage, creating a hidden depression that caught her foot and sent her tumbling forward, the wood scattering around her as she fought to regain her footing. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her as she floundered in the deep snow, the white chaos closing over her like a living thing. But then James was there, his strong hands lifting her up, his body shielding her from the worst of the wind. "I've got you," he shouted over the howling storm, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I've got you." And he did. Ruth could feel his strength surrounding her, protecting her, and for the first time in months, she felt truly safe, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually safe in a way that had nothing to do with locked doors or weapons or distance. This was the safety that came from being known, from being accepted exactly as she was, wounds and all, from being valued not for what she could provide, but for who she was beneath the damage. They made it back to the cabin with their precious cargo, stumbling through the door like survivors of a shipwreck, their clothes crusted with snow and their faces numb from the cold. James quickly rebuilt the fire while Ruth shed her snow-covered outer layers, her hands shaking from cold and adrenaline, but her heart singing with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt since before her world fell apart. The warmth of the fire felt like a benediction after their battle with the storm, and Ruth stood close to the flames, letting the heat penetrate her chilled bones while steam rose from her damp clothes. Her hands were shaking from more than just the cold, she realized. The adrenaline of their shared ordeal was coursing through her veins, making her feel more alive than she had in months. "Thank you," James said as he fed wood into the hungry flames, the fire leaping higher and casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Couldn't have done it alone." Ruth looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the weathered exterior to the man beneath. Snow was melting in his beard, and his cheeks were red from the cold, but his eyes held a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He was thanking her, acknowledging her contribution as an equal partner in their survival, recognizing her courage and strength rather than focusing on her vulnerability. When was the last time anyone had valued her strength rather than her weakness? When had anyone looked at her and seen capability instead of damage? "Neither could I," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. That night, as the storm continued to rage outside, they sat closer to the fire than they had before. Not touching, but close enough that Ruth could feel the warmth radiating from James's body, close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, the sounds somehow comforting in a way that surprised her. It was a small step, but it felt monumental, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. The fire crackled and danced, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the log walls, and Ruth found herself mesmerized by the flames. There was something hypnotic about fire, something that spoke to the most primitive parts of the human brain, the parts that remembered when warmth and light meant the difference between life and death. "Tell me about before," she said eventually, her voice soft in the intimate space they had created. "Before you came to the mountains." James was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames as if they might reveal the secrets of his past, the ghost that had driven him to this isolated place. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old sorrow, carefully controlled, but never fully healed. "I was a different man then," he said, each word chosen with care. "Had a farm down in the valley, a wife, plans for children. Thought I knew what life was supposed to look like, thought I had it all figured out." Ruth could hear the pain in his voice, the way it caught slightly on the word wife, and she found herself leaning forward, drawn by the rare glimpse into his carefully guarded past. "What happened?" "Men came in the night, claim jumpers, looking to steal what we'd built, what we'd worked for." His voice was steady, but Ruth could hear the pain underneath, still raw after all these years. "They killed Sarah while I was away checking the shuttle. When I came home and found her—" He trailed off, his hands clenching into fists in his lap. Ruth reached out instinctively, wanting to offer comfort, but stopped herself before her fingers could make contact. The gesture hung in the air between them, an almost touch that somehow carried more weight than physical contact might have, a bridge of understanding that spanned the careful distance they maintained. "When I found them, I lost myself," James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did things that needed doing but left marks on my soul that won't ever fade. Killed them all, and felt nothing but satisfaction at the time. It wasn't until later that the weight of it settled on me." "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. "We all carry our ghosts," James replied, turning to meet her gaze. "Question is whether we let them haunt us or teach us." Over the following days, as the storm finally exhausted itself and the world emerged white and pristine, transformed by the snow into something alien and beautiful, Ruth found herself thinking about James's words. She had been letting her ghosts haunt her, allowing the trauma to define every aspect of her existence, to reduce her to nothing more than a collection of fears and wounds. But what if there was another way? What if she could transform her pain into something else, something that might help her reclaim the woman she used to be? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, a possibility that felt both impossible and inevitable. The process was slow and often painful, like learning to walk again after a devastating injury. Some days Ruth felt strong enough to help James with his daily tasks, learning to skin rabbits and preserve meat, to read the weather signs in the behavior of birds and the color of the sky, to identify edible plants and understand the subtle rhythms of mountain life. Other days, the memories would crash over her like a tide, leaving her curled up by the fire, shaking with remembered terror and the overwhelming certainty that she would never be whole again. On those days, James never pushed, never demanded more than she was able to give, never made her feel guilty for her weakness or ashamed of her fear. He became a silent guardian, watching over her without judgment or impatience, offering comfort through his mere presence rather than words or gestures. It was a kind of love she had never experienced before, patient and unconditional, asking nothing in return except the chance to help her heal. Spring came late to the mountains that year, arriving in fits and starts with warm days followed by sudden snowfalls that reminded them winter wasn't quite finished with its grip on the high country. Ruth had been living in the cabin for nearly 4 months when she woke one morning to the sound of water dripping from the eaves and birds calling from the trees, their songs bright and hopeful after the long silence of winter. The world was beginning to thaw, and with it, something inside her chest that had been frozen for far too long. She could feel it happening, a gradual warming that started in her heart and spread outward, melting the ice that had formed around her emotions and leaving her feeling raw and vulnerable, but strangely hopeful. She found James on the porch, drinking coffee from a tin cup and watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of golden rose. The light creeping down the mountainsides like honey poured from a great height. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and melting snow, and Ruth felt a sense of renewal that had nothing to do with the changing seasons and everything to do with the man beside her. For the first time since her arrival, Ruth stepped up beside him without hesitation, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body and smell the familiar sense of soap and leather and mountain air that clung to his clothes. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant more than just the view, though the vista spread before them was breathtaking in its scope and grandeur. "It is," James agreed, and she knew he understood the deeper meaning behind her words, the way he seemed to understand everything about her without needing explanation. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light creep down the mountainsides and chase away the shadows of night, and Ruth felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. It was a quiet contentment that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with belonging, with finding her place in the world after months of feeling lost and adrift. "I've been thinking," she said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper, "about what comes next." James tensed slightly beside her, and she could feel the careful control he exercised over his emotions, the way he held himself ready for disappointment or loss. "You thinking of leaving?" The question held no accusation, no attempt to guilt her into staying or make her feel obligated to remain. He was simply asking, prepared to accept whatever answer she gave, and Ruth realized that this was what real love looked like. Not the possessive desperation she had mistaken for affection in the past, but this willingness to let go, if that was what she needed, to put her welfare above his own desires. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of uncertainty and possibility in equal measure. "Part of me thinks I should go back, try to rebuild my old life, pretend that none of this ever happened. But another part of me wonders if that woman even exists anymore. If she died the night they—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "She exists," James said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "She's just been through hell and come out stronger on the other side. Different, maybe, but stronger." Ruth turned to look at him, studying the profile that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. The strong jaw and weathered cheeks, the gray eyes that saw too much and revealed too little. "What about you? Do you ever think about going back to the world?" "Every day," he admitted, his honesty as refreshing as mountain air. "But I made my peace with solitude a long time ago. Don't know if I'd fit anywhere else anymore. Don't know if I remember how to be around people who haven't seen the things I've seen." "You fit with me," Ruth said, the words emerging before she could stop them, carrying more weight and meaning than she had intended. James turned to meet her gaze. his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to read the truth written there. Ruth, I know what I said when I first came here, about not being able to bear a man's touch, about being broken beyond repair. But that was fear talking, not truth. The truth is, I've been learning to trust again, learning to see the difference between taking and giving, between violence and tenderness. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage like a cloak around her shoulders. The truth is, I think I'm ready. James didn't move, didn't reach for her or assume that her words were an invitation to take what he wanted. Instead, he waited, just as he had promised that first night, letting her set the pace and define the boundaries, respecting her autonomy, even in this moment of vulnerability. Ruth stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his beard and the way his pulse jumped in the hollow of his throat. Slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a wild animal, she reached out and placed her palm against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. The contact sent a shock through her system, but it wasn't the familiar spike of panic and revulsion she had expected. Instead, it felt like coming home, like finding a piece of herself she had thought lost forever. James covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle and warm, careful not to trap or constrain her. "You sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sure," Ruth whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the brutal taking she had experienced before. Nothing like the violence that had been done to her in the name of desire. James's lips were soft against hers, questioning rather than demanding, offering rather than stealing, asking permission with every gentle pressure and caress. Ruth felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she realized that this was what tenderness felt like. This careful cherishing that honored her worth rather than diminishing it, that saw her as a person to be treasured rather than an object to be used. The kiss was sweet and patient, full of promise and possibility, and she found herself leaning into it, into him, allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way she had thought impossible. When they finally broke apart, James rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly uneven, his eyes closed as if he were savoring the moment. "I've wanted to do that for months," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you?" Ruth asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because you weren't ready, and I'd rather wait forever than rush you into something that might hurt you, that might undo all the healing you have done." Ruth felt her heart swell with an emotion she was almost afraid to name, a feeling so intense and overwhelming that it threatened to bring her to her knees. This was love, real love, the kind that put the other person's needs ahead of its own desires, that waited and watched and hoped without demanding guarantees or immediate gratification. "I love you," she said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue, like a foreign language she was just learning to speak. James smiled, that rare expression that transformed his entire face and revealed the man he had been before sorrow and violence marked him. The smile reached his eyes, warming them like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and Ruth felt something inside her chest flutter and take wing. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Have since the day you showed up half frozen on my doorstep, all defiance and terror and stubborn courage. You were the bravest thing I'd ever seen, and you didn't even know it." They spent the morning talking, really talking, about their fears and hopes and the possibility of a future together, their words weaving between them like golden thread, binding them closer with each shared revelation. Ruth learned that James had been a teacher before tragedy changed his path, that he loved poetry and philosophy and had dreamed of writing a book someday about the lessons he had learned in his years of solitude. James learned that Ruth had been a seamstress, that she missed the feel of fine fabric beneath her fingers and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful from raw materials, of taking disparate pieces and joining them into something whole and useful. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, the small details that make up a life, and Ruth realized that she was sharing parts of herself she had thought lost forever. "We could make a life here," Ruth said as they walked through the clearing, her hand tucked securely in James's, their fingers intertwined like the roots of two trees growing together. A real life, not just survival. You'd want that? To stay in the mountains? To build something together in this wild place? Ruth looked around at the towering pines and distant peaks, at the cabin that had become her sanctuary, and the man who had helped her find herself again. The mountains had tested her, challenged her, forced her to discover strength she didn't know she possessed. They had also sheltered her, protected her, given her space to heal and grow. I think maybe the mountains are where I belong now, she said, her voice carrying certainty that surprised her. Where we belong. That afternoon, they began planning their future in earnest, their conversation animated with excitement and possibility. James showed Ruth the meadow where he thought they might plant a garden, the rich soil perfect for vegetables and herbs, the spot by the creek where they could build a larger cabin if they decided to expand their small household. They talked about practical things like supplies and livestock, about the challenges of mountain living and the rewards of self-sufficiency. But underneath the mundane details was a current of excitement, the thrill of building something together, of creating a life that was uniquely their own. As evening approached, they returned to the cabin hand in hand, their steps slow and deliberate as if neither wanted the day to end. Ruth felt nervous but determined as they climbed the stairs together, James moving slowly to give her every opportunity to change her mind, to retreat to the safety of her locked room if the reality of intimacy proved too overwhelming. But she didn't want to change her mind. For the first time in months, she wanted to be close to someone, wanted to experience the intimacy that came from trust and love, rather than a force and fear. She wanted to reclaim this part of herself, to prove that the men who had hurt her hadn't won, hadn't stolen her capacity for joy and connection and physical pleasure. James lit candles around the small room, creating a warm glow that chased away the shadows and filled the space with golden light. He moved with the same careful deliberation he had shown since the day they met, never assuming, always asking permission with his eyes and his gentle touches, treating her like something precious and fragile that might break if handled roughly. "We can stop any time," he said as he traced the line of her jaw with one finger, his touch feather-light and reverent. "Just say the word." And Asrai stepped back, no questions asked. But Ruth didn't want to stop. She wanted to reclaim this part of herself, to prove that she was more than her trauma, more than the sum of her wounds. With James, she felt safe enough to be vulnerable, strong enough to choose intimacy on her own terms. Their lovemaking was a revelation, tender and patient, and completely different from anything Ruth had experienced before. A slow dance of discovery that honored both their needs and fears. James worshipped her body with his hands and mouth, erasing the memory of brutal touches with caresses that spoke of reverence rather than conquest, of love rather than lust. He took his time, building her pleasure slowly and carefully, always watching her face for signs of distress, always ready to stop if she needed him to, never taking more than she was willing to give. His touch was gentle but sure, confident but respectful, and Ruth found herself responding in ways she had thought impossible, her body awakening to sensations she had believed lost forever. When Ruth finally cried out his name, her body arching beneath his, in a release that was both physical and emotional, she felt something inside her chest break open and release a flood of feelings she had been holding back for months. These were tears of joy rather than sorrow, tears of healing rather than pain, tears that washed away the last of the poison that had been eating at her soul. James held her as she wept, stroking her hair and murmuring words of love and reassurance until the storm passed, until she was left feeling clean and whole in a way she had forgotten was possible. His arms were strong around her, protective but not possessive, offering shelter without demanding surrender. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, tasting salt on her lips. "For what?" "For waiting, for seeing me as more than my damage, for helping me find myself again, for showing me that love doesn't have to hurt." James pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his lips warm against her hair. "Thank you for trusting me with your heart, for being brave enough to try again." They lay entwined as the candles burned low, their bodies fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that had finally found its completion, talking softly about their plans for tomorrow and the day after that and all the days to come. Ruth felt a sense of wholeness she hadn't known she was missing, as if all the broken pieces of herself had finally been fitted back together in a new and stronger configuration. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, but it no longer sounded threatening or lonely. It sounded like a lullaby, like the mountain itself was welcoming her home, accepting her as part of its wild and beautiful landscape. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and contentment, each day bringing new discoveries and deeper connection. Ruth threw herself into preparing for their life together with the same determination she had once applied to mere survival, channeling her energy into creation rather than self-protection. She planted seeds in the small garden plot James cleared for her, working the rich mountain soil with her hands, feeling the earth cool and damp between her fingers. She tended the young shoots with careful attention, watering them each morning and evening, pulling weeds with the patience of someone who understood that growth took time and nurturing. There was something deeply satisfying about watching things grow under her care, about seeing the tiny green shoots push through the dark soil toward the light. It felt like a metaphor for her own healing, the slow but steady progress from darkness towards something bright and hopeful. James began work on expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen where Ruth could pursue her love of cooking, where they could entertain guests if any ever found their way to this remote sanctuary. They worked side by side during the long spring days, their hands growing calloused from shared labor, their bodies growing strong from mountain living and honest work. But their happiness was not to go unchallenged. One evening in late spring, as Ruth was tending her garden and James was splitting wood for the winter supply that was never far from his thoughts, the sound of horses' hooves echoed through the clearing, shattering the peaceful silence like stones thrown through glass. Ruth's blood turned to ice as she recognized the sound, memories of that terrible night flooding back with crushing force, threatening to drown her in remembered terror. She had thought herself safe, had believed that the mountains would protect her from the past, but now she realized that some demons were too persistent to be outrun. Three men rode into the clearing, their faces hard and their intentions unclear, their presence a violation of the sanctuary she and James had built together. Ruth recognized none of them, but something about their bearing, the way they sat their horses and surveyed the cabin like predators evaluating prey, made her stomach clench with familiar terror. James straightened slowly, the axe still in his hands, his body positioning itself between Ruth and the riders with the instinctive protectiveness of a wolf defending his mate. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral but carrying an undertone of warning. The leader of the group, a man with cruel eyes and a scar across his left cheek that spoke of violence both given and received, smiled without warmth, the expression more threat than greeting. "We're looking for a woman, goes by the name of Ruth Moore. Heard she might be up this way." Ruth felt her knees go weak, the strength draining from her legs as if someone had opened a valve and let it all flow out. Somehow, impossibly, they had found her. The past she thought she had escaped had tracked her to this remote sanctuary, threatening to destroy everything she had built with James, everything she had fought so hard to reclaim. "Don't know anyone by that name," James replied calmly, but Ruth could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his grip shifted on the axe handle, preparing for violence while hoping it could be avoided. The scarred man laughed, a sound devoid of humor that made Ruth's skin crawl. "That's funny, because we have it on good authority that she's been seen in these parts. Pretty little thing, dark hair, probably looking a bit worse for wear after her adventures." Ruth wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the forest and keep running until she reached the edge of the world, until she found a place where the past couldn't follow and the future stretched out unmarked before her. But her legs wouldn't obey her, and she found herself frozen in place, watching the confrontation unfold with growing dread and the sick certainty that her newfound happiness was about to be destroyed. "Like I said," James repeated, his voice steady as stone, carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of facing down danger. "Don't know anyone by that description." "Well then, you won't mind if we take a look around," the second rider said, already dismounting with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Just to satisfy our curiosity." "Actually, I would mind," James replied, raising the axe slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakable in its intent. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." The three men exchanged glances, and Ruth could practically see them calculating odds and advantages, weighing the potential rewards against the obvious risks. James was outnumbered, but he had the high ground and the advantage of knowing the terrain. More importantly, he had something to protect, and desperate men were often more dangerous than confident ones. Now see, that's where you're wrong, the leader said, his hand drifting toward the gun at his hip with practiced ease. We represent certain interested parties who have a legal claim on the woman we're seeking. She stole something that doesn't belong to her, and we're here to collect what's owed. Ruth's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with a familiar panic that threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed defenses. They weren't just random bounty hunters or men seeking revenge for some imagined slight. They were working for someone specific, someone with enough money and influence to track her across hundreds of miles of wilderness. But who? And what could they possibly think she had stolen? Even if I knew this woman you're looking for, James said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, I'd need to see some kind of official documentation before I'd consider helping you find her. The scarred man's smile widened, revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco and neglect. Oh, we've got documentation, all right. Got a warrant signed by a judge down in Denver, authorizing us to retrieve stolen property and return it to its rightful owner. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, holding it up just long enough for James to see the official seal before tucking it away again, the gesture calculated to impress without allowing close examination. Woman named Ruth Moore absconded with a substantial sum of money and certain valuable items belonging to her former employer. We're authorized to use whatever means necessary to recover what was taken. Ruth felt the world tilt beneath her feet, reality shifting like sand in an hourglass as the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Former employer? The only person who could be described as her employer was Marcus Whitman, the wealthy rancher whose house she had worked in as a seamstress and whose son had... Her stomach lurched as understanding crashed over her like a wave. Marcus Whitman had sent these men, had fabricated charges of theft to justify dragging her back to face his son's twisted desires to silence her before she could tell anyone what had really happened in that house of horrors. The warrant was probably real enough, purchased with Whitman money and influence, but the charges were lies built on a foundation of corruption and cover-up. The woman we're seeking is considered dangerous, the third rider added, speaking for the first time, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man reciting a well-rehearsed script. She attacked her employer's family and fled in the night. Could be armed, definitely unstable. You'd be doing a public service by helping us locate her. James's knuckles were white where he gripped the axe, and Ruth could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the careful control he was exercising over his temper. He knew they were lying, could probably see through their fabricated story as easily as she could, but that didn't make them any less dangerous or their intentions any less real. I'm going to ask you one more time to leave my property, James said, his voice carrying a note of finality that made the horses shift nervously beneath their riders, sensing the tension that crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. And I'm going to tell you one more time that we're not leaving without what we came for, the leader replied, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt, the threat implicit but unmistakable. Now you can make this easy on yourself and tell us where she is, or we can tear this place apart board by board until we find her. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, and Ruth realized that violence was inevitable, that these men hadn't come to negotiate or reason, but to take her back by force. Consequences be damned. They would kill James if he tried to stop them, would destroy everything they had built together without a second thought. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let the man she loved die because of her past, because of the evil that other men had done. Taking a deep breath that felt like swallowing fire, Ruth stepped out from behind the woodpile where she had been hiding, her legs shaking, but her voice surprisingly steady. I'm Ruth Moore, she said, the words carrying across the clearing with the force of a challenge. And I didn't steal anything. All eyes turned toward her, and Ruth felt the familiar spike of terror as the three men evaluated her with predatory interest, their gazes crawling over her like insects on skin. But underneath the fear was something new, something that felt almost like courage. born from months of healing and the love of a good man who had shown her what she was truly worth. She wasn't the same broken woman who had stumbled into James's cabin months ago, shattered and bleeding and barely alive. She was stronger now, more sure of her own worth, and she wouldn't go quietly into whatever hell these men represented. "There she is," the scarred man said with satisfaction, his voice carrying the ugly triumph of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "Pretty as a picture, just like the boss said." "Ruth, get back inside," James ordered, without taking his eyes off the riders, his voice carrying absolute authority. "No," Ruth replied, walking slowly toward the center of the clearing with deliberate steps, each footfall an act of defiance. "This is my fight, James. It always has been." She stopped about 10 feet from the mounted men, close enough to see the cruel anticipation in their eyes, but far enough away to run if necessary, though she knew that running would only delay the inevitable. "You said I stole something from Marcus Whitman. What exactly am I supposed to have taken?" The leader reached into his saddlebags and produced a small leather pouch, shaking it so the contents clinked together with the musical sound of metal on metal. Gold coins, jewelry, family heirlooms, took them right out of the safe in his study, according to the report. Ruth laughed, a sound bitter as winter wind, harsh with the knowledge of how easily truth could be twisted into lies. "The only thing I took from the Whitman ranch was my own life, and barely managed that. If you want to know what really happened there, I'll tell you. But I don't think Marcus Whitman wants that story getting around." "Don't much care about stories," the second rider said, dismounting and taking a step toward her, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Just care about bringing you back to face justice." "Justice?" Ruth's voice rose, months of suppressed anger finally finding an outlet, the rage she had buried beneath layers of fear and shame suddenly blazing to life. "You want to talk about justice? Then let's talk about what Thomas Whitman did to me in his father's house. Let's talk about how he and his friends held me down and—" "That's enough," the leader snapped, his face flushing with anger or embarrassment, the mask of professional detachment slipping to reveal something uglier beneath. "Nobody wants to hear your lies and excuses." "They're not lies," Ruth said fiercely, her voice carrying the ring of absolute truth, the kind of conviction that couldn't be faked or manufactured. "And you know it. That's why Marcus Whitman sent you instead of the law. That's why you have a fake warrant and a made-up story about theft. He knows what his son did, and he's trying to cover it up by silencing me." James had moved closer during the exchange, the axe held ready in his hands, his body coiled like a spring ready to unleash violence in defense of the woman he loved. "You heard her," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded storms. "She's not going anywhere with you." The scarred man drew his gun in one smooth motion, the metal gleaming dully in the afternoon light, the weapon steady in his experienced hand. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Mountain Man. The woman comes with us, willing or not." "Over my dead body," James replied, and Ruth could hear the absolute conviction in his voice, the willingness to die rather than let her be taken. "That can be arranged," the gunman said, thumbing back the hammer with an audible click that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, each second stretching like taffy as adrenaline flooded Ruth's system and sharpened her perception to crystal clarity. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. James raised the axe and prepared to charge into almost certain death. And Ruth realized that the man she loved was about to die because of her past, because of the evil that other men had done. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. With a cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, a sound that was part rage and part desperation and part something that might have been joy, Ruth launched herself at the mounted gunman, her fingers clawing for his weapon with the desperate strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The gun discharged with a deafening roar that echoed off the mountainsides like thunder, the bullet going wide as Ruth's weight knocked the rider sideways in his saddle, both of them struggling for control of the weapon that would determine who lived and who died. The clearing erupted into chaos, the careful stillness of the mountain afternoon shattered by violence and the desperate struggle for survival. James's axe caught the second rider in the shoulder as he tried to draw his own weapon, the blade biting deep and spinning him around like a child's top, before sending him crashing to the ground with a scream of pain and rage. The third man wheeled his horse in a tight circle, trying to get a clear shot at James while avoiding the thrashing hooves of his leader's mount. But Ruth was still grappling with the scarred man, her desperation giving her strength she didn't know she possessed, the kind of power that came from having everything to lose and nothing left to fear. The scarred man backhanded her across the face, the blow sending stars exploding across her vision and sending her tumbling to the ground. But she had accomplished her goal. The gun flew from his grasp, landing in the dirt several feet away, temporarily evening the odds in this deadly game. James was there in an instant, placing himself between Ruth and her attacker like a mountain made flesh, the bloody axe held ready in his hands, his face transformed by a cold fury that made him look like something out of legend. This was the man who had killed before, the one who understood violence and wasn't afraid to use it when everything he loved was threatened. "It's over," James said, his voice deadly calm, carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute conviction. "Get on your horses and ride out of here, or I'll bury all three of you in the woods where nobody will ever find the bodies." The wounded rider was clutching his shoulder and moaning, blood seeping between his fingers and staining his shirt, a spreading crimson, his face pale with shock and pain. The third man had his gun drawn but seemed reluctant to use it, perhaps finally realizing that James Baker was not a man to be trifled with, that he had awakened something dangerous and implacable. The leader sat his horse and glared down at them, his face twisted with rage and frustration, the careful professional mask completely abandoned now. Blood trickled from a cut on his lip where Ruth had clawed him, and his eyes burned with the kind of hatred that promised future violence. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice thick with promise and threat. "Marcus Whitman has a long reach and a longer memory. He'll send more men, better men. You can't protect her forever." "Maybe not," James replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute determination. "But I can protect her today, and tomorrow, and the day after that. Long as it takes." Ruth struggled to her feet, her cheek throbbing from the blow, but her spirit unbroken, stronger than it had ever been. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer controlled her. She had faced her demons and fought back, had chosen courage over surrender, and that made all the difference. "Tell Marcus Whitman that I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing, ringing with the kind of truth that couldn't be denied or ignored. "Tell him that if he wants to destroy me, he'll have to do better than sending cowards with fake warrants and fabricated stories." The scarred man spat into the dirt, a gesture of contempt and defeat, then jerked his horse's head around with unnecessary violence. "Help him up," he ordered the third rider, indicating their wounded companion. "We're done here." They watched in tense silence as the three men rode away, the wounded rider swaying in his saddle and leaving a trail of blood drops in the dirt, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading into the distance until only the whisper of wind through pine needles remained. Only when they were completely out of sight did James lower the axe and turn to examine Ruth's injured face, his fingers gentle as butterfly wings as they traced the bruise that was already forming on her cheek, his touch a benediction after the violence that had just passed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft with concern and something that might have been wonder. "I'm fine," Ruth replied, and realized she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Better than fine, actually. For the first time in my life, I stood up for myself. I fought back." James smiled, that rare expression that lit up his entire face like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming him from a weathered mountain man into something approaching beautiful. "You were magnificent. Scared the hell out of me, but magnificent." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, their fingers intertwined like the roots of trees that had grown together, and Ruth felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the confrontation they had just survived and everything to do with the woman she had become. She had faced her past and refused to be defined by it, had chosen love over fear and courage over safety, and in doing so, she had finally become the person she was meant to be. The mountains had tested her and found her worthy, had stripped away everything false, and left only what was true and strong and enduring. That evening, as they sat by the fire and planned their response to the inevitable return of Marcus Whitman's men, discussing everything from early warning systems to escape routes to the possibility of contacting the territorial marshal, Ruth realized that she was no longer running from her past. She was building a future, one day at a time, with the man who had taught her that love was patient, that trust could be rebuilt like a cabin after a fire, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was wait for someone to be ready to accept what you had to offer. "I love you, James Baker," she said as the flames danced in the hearth and the mountain winds sang through the pines like a lullaby written by the wilderness itself. "I love you too, Ruth Moore," he replied, pulling her close until she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and strong as the mountains themselves. "And I'll wait for you as long as you need me to, forever if necessary." But Ruth was done waiting, done hiding, done letting fear dictate the shape of her life. She was ready to live, ready to love, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring with the strength she had discovered in herself and the love they had built together. In the shelter of James's arms, surrounded by the wild beauty of the mountains that had become her home and her sanctuary, she finally understood that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about choosing to write a new story, one where love triumphed over fear and hope conquered despair, where broken things could be made whole again through patience and care, and the kind of love that asked for nothing except the chance to help someone heal. The mountains had made her strong, teaching her lessons about survival and resilience that no classroom could provide. But James had made her whole, showing her that she was worthy of love and protection and all the good things she had thought lost forever. And together they would face whatever tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that some bonds were stronger than fear, some love deeper than pain, and some promises worth waiting a lifetime to fulfill. The future stretched before them like an unmarked trail, full of possibility and hope, and Ruth Moore was finally ready to walk it.